Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 784th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Stuart Comer, Michelle Kuo, and Charlotte Kent. We're thrilled to welcome poet Alyssa Moore here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land that we're speaking from. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guests and host. Michelle Kuo is the Marlene Hess Curator of Painting and Sculpture at MoMA, where her exhibitions include Rafik Anadol Unsupervised, among many others. In addition to helping conceive the museum's collection display and acquisitions program, Kuo co-leads initiatives on mid-century art history and on digital art and blockchain technologies. She has written and lectured widely. Her publications include More Than Real, Art in the Digital Age, and a forthcoming volume on the post-war organization, Experiments in Art and Technology. Stuart Comer is MoMA's Lonti Ebers Chief Curator of Media and Performance. He oversees the collection and diverse program of exhibitions, events, and acquisitions for the Department of Media and Performance. He also leads the Marie-Josée and Henry Kravis studio, the museum space dedicated to performance, music, sound, spoken word, and expanded approaches to the moving image. And our host today, Assistant Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University, Dr. Charlotte Kent, has a particular interest in historical frameworks for art practices with a research focus on contemporary digital culture and the absurd. She writes for assorted magazines and various academic journals, and we're lucky to have her as an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Charlotte Kent.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. Thank you, Michelle and Stuart, for joining today. Given that I know we have some limited time, I want to just jump right in. You posited this really interesting concept with signals, and I want to read a very brief excerpt from the catalog essay you all wrote to sort of position the overarching concept of the show before we actually dive into individual works. You wrote that the televisual image was already shown to be unreliable, fake, simulated, a sham, and so what was broadcast was not as important as challenging the broadcast system altogether. The signal was the weapon. The signal itself could be turned against the system, rerouted or configured to create alternative systems of communication. This becomes evident in pirate TV stations, using signals to connect otherwise distanced people, presentations of mundane aspects of life. All of these appear in the show. But can you share with us a little bit about how this notion really anchored your minds around this moment and this body of work as a way of shifting away from thinking of video as a medium?
Yes, thanks for that great introduction and question to start things off. I mean, I think part of what was fascinating about going through the works for the show was really thinking about video not as a stable medium and not as a stable medium that was only rooted to the cinematic or the documentary. So that was really the starting point for us to think about video as a network, as a set of signals, and therefore as something that was really about the ways in which artists could either challenge, for example, hegemonic networks of commercial broadcast television in the West, or, for example, state-run media in other parts of the world, as well as the West, and to think about how artists could, or were excited about taking that signal back for themselves, whether inserting their own works into existing broadcast networks or creating their own pirate television stations, or creating their own works that were on tape and then were even mailed around or shared among friends, or took actually public space or even sculptural installations and forms and incorporated video into a kind of public space in that way, or a sculptural experience. And that led to paths both in and outside the museum, among many other venues. And so we were thinking about this physical transgression as well as like a network transgression that many of these artists took too.
Yeah, I think that summarizes it very well. I would just add, I mean, we keep saying it's not a medium and it's not about the image. It really is about, to Michelle's point, images that are always imminent, always networked, always simultaneous. Oftentimes images occurring in multiple places at once that are actually connected by this technology. And so we really just want to emphasize the network, the formation of space, the formation of publics. And to that end, the show really moves away from the black box as the space of priority for these images, and really to the apparatus, to architectural space, to different kinds of hardware that deliver these images. So, yeah.
And one thing just to add to that too is that, for many of these artists, we basically start the show in the mid-60s. And that's, of course, not by coincidence, because that's around the point in time when equipment like the Sony Portapak gets released. And so more people, not all people by any means, but more people have access to tools of video recording and video cameras. You didn't have to go necessarily to a professional broadcasting studio, somehow work your way in there to take video or broadcast it. So with that access, artists get very excited about essentially taking on mass media. Television, as in the quote that you read, was for many seen as this horrible Big Brother brainwashing you, we're all just duped spectators. And of course, that's true to a certain extent. But a lot of artists said, well, why can't we intervene in these media systems? Why can't we actually have agency within them? We're not just going to reject them or critique them. We'll do that as well, but we'll do that in a way that's through maybe creating something new. And that was something that was, again, really just fascinating to work with in all of these pieces.
I have to say, your replies have set me up so well for all the questions that I have for you. So this is great. I'm going to have us just back up for a second on the slides, because I want to position something from the top. In that opening slide, around the corner from what is actually visible in that image is a work by Tiffany Sia. It's Never Rest, Unrest. And it's a work that folds resistance into everyday life. And that's a phrase that she uses in her own essay about it. And I was really struck by the fact that at the opening of this show that has been, much touted about the politics that you all are presenting and so forth, that you position this work at the beginning. And I was really quite moved by that. I mean, it's a way of pushing against some of the other kinds of content that we expect. But it's also doing a similar kind of work of questioning this kind of like media that, Michelle was just describing as sort of a fluvia of content, right? Like what Gretchen Bender is trying to do. And as soon as you walk through the opening doors, right? Like there you are with the Gretchen Bender work and like really trying to get us to think about what we're being shown. That's in the next slide, if we can go to that one for a second. And then, so you see it here over to the right for the audience, it's just a Martin Manoogian, which I know we'll talk about in a moment, but, and then, but it's also true with like Ming Wang, right? And so I was wondering why you thought right now, where we are at, it was important to include this presentation of the sort of never rest quality of an uprising or of political action. Why was that something to herald at the top of the show?
Well, I think you get to the show and immediately, the show is roughly chronological, by the way, but there are all of these asynchronous moments. If you go see it, you'll notice. So at the very outset, before you even get into the first gallery, you have Hole in Space, this what the artist called a telecommunications sculpture on the left from 1980. And then you have Tiffany Shaw's work, fast forward decades later. And I think Tiffany's work is all about getting away from the spectacle of unrest as it often is played out on, for example, mass media. We see action, protests, violence. And of course, you see that in this very personally made, all shot on her iPhone work that she says anyone could have made, but actually it's very poetically and beautifully montaged. So I think that it's an incredible artwork, but she then dwells on all of these moments of downtime, quote unquote, of anxiety, of what happens when you are an active participant in something, but then you go home and you have to deal with shielding your identity or thinking about, the safety of yourself and your family. But it plays out in against the backdrop of mundane everyday life. And so that collision, that kind of paradox of, putting yourself on the line for something as an activist or as part of a pro-democracy movement, at the same time, you're still experiencing, sometimes surreally, the flow of everyday life. You have to go home and feed your cat. So there are all of these juxtapositions that seem really crucial to the fact that when artists have deployed video throughout the past several decades, they've often used it to think about liveness and simultaneity and the fact that you're not just looking at the climax of an event, you're looking at the duration of kind of life unspooling in front of you. Stuart, I don't know if you...
Yeah, and I also just wanted to mention, since you referred to the Gretchen Bender, that work was originally shown in 1990 directly across the street from MoMA on 53rd Street in the window of the Donnell Library. And we really wanted to stress to some extent, just doubling down on this concept of the public sphere and public space, that a lot of this work was not shown in the art sphere. It was not shown in museums or galleries. It was broadcast. It was shown on the street. Dara Birnbaum's renowned video technology transformation Wonder Woman was shown in the shop front of a hair salon in Soho. So, these were not always, confined by the white cube. They were oftentimes in a direct interface with public space. That's true of Hole in Space as well, which was a live broadcast from Lincoln Center and Culver City in a shopping mall. So, these really played out publicly in a different way than art had traditionally behaved. And then when you get to Tiffany's work, I think it really builds on that in such an important way that you see the formation of the crowd from the point of view of someone participating in the crowd in a way that cameras could not have achieved a few decades ago. And the iPhone has enabled that possibility in a different way. And I often think about this work in relation to somebody like Alan Sekula, whose whole body of work tended to focus more on slide presentations rather than video, but really trying to find modes of representation that moved away from the way the media would almost exploit a political event. And so to this degree, I think, as Charlotte already said, it creates a different kind of register. It's very personal. It's a different kind of POV than we typically see in the news or in other forms of media saturation. And so it just feels very radical. And then the letterboxing is very intentional. So it really emphasizes the iPhone is the format through which, that is the keynote eye through which this is actually being encountered. But I also think it's important to stress the iPhone because, like Gretchen Bender's work or like Dara Birnbaum's work, the iPhone is the shop front now. It's not only a means of politics or media connection, it's also a means of commerce and shopping. And so all of these things are being collapsed into one surface. And so I think Tiffany's work gets at that in a really powerful way.
Well, and obviously all of our data, literally social media on the phone is a way of, is the greatest monetization of our data of all, right? So we're all participating in that actively whenever we interact in any way on social media. And so I think Tiffany's work also gets at that double bind, right, of the democratization of media on the one hand, and then all of those things that it's wrought that maybe people did not quite foresee how that would unfold.
But also, if Hall in Space was radical because somebody in New York literally made an appointment to meet their cousin in Los Angeles at 3 p.m. and they could literally talk to each other across a couple of thousand miles via this live feed. But what you couldn't do at that moment was, screen grab it and send it. And that's what Tiffany's works also implies, is the ability to send the documentation of a political event of this magnitude. And that is itself not only a means of documentation, but a means of politics. And, witness the Arab Spring, witness how TikTok has functioned with what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, this ability to capture and send. And, really, I think has brought the whole concept of video as a means of image production, but also communication full circle.
I think, I totally agree. And it's interesting because I realized once we were working with some of the images, Shaw's work, the image we have up here right now in many ways doesn't reflect what you might see if you're standing in front of it, because you're seeing trees, you're seeing images of the sky, you're seeing, these really everyday shots, right? Like it could be anywhere, almost anything could be happening. And that appears at one moment with the Harun Farooqi standing outside on the on the balcony, and there's the demonstrators in the background, right? I think it's something that has been the sort of recurring thread across some of this type of work, is this notion of the resistance, which is foregrounded, is often this sort of continuous background experience for people who are active in the resistance, right? Because you have to make breakfast, you have to shower. Well, I mean, no obligations to shower, but, and I think it's one of the things that really struck me as beautiful. And one of the reasons I was asking about it for our own time is because one of the reasons that people often, sort of struggle with, protest movements or resistance movements is the sense that I don't have time, right? I don't have time for that kind of commitment or something. And it doesn't take into account the way in which that can actually be, it just becomes a part of your life, right? It's just always sort of there. And it made me think about the way in which there's been, the NAP ministry has arisen as a part of, Black women's, wanting to articulate the way in which labor is constantly being requested, and how rest is a type of resistance in and of itself, right? And so there's something about the gentleness of Shaw's work that I just found incredibly moving in the context of the fact that revolutions don't happen in that one instant where you see the big boom happen on, 10 o'clock news. It's this like day after day, week after week, month after month, often incredibly slow and mundane, continuous effort. And so I just thought in the context of the show, it was really nice to position that. Shifting gears a little bit to something somewhat less restful for many, I'm wondering if we could go to Videodrome, because it obviously is an incredible experience to be able to experience this, right? I mean, it's a historical work. It's sort of incredible that you've set it up. I went in there and I lay down on the floor, right? Like I was just like, I'm gonna be in a hippie tent and enjoy this experience. And the psychedelia of the overlaid images, really sort of produces that effect of like the way thoughts get overlaid one on top of the other. But it's beautifully choreographed. It is just a beautifully choreographed work. And it doesn't have that kind of stressful flickering that we often associate with this kind of collage aesthetic. And that often makes people sort of uncomfortable with moving image work. And so that kind of got me thinking about this other thing, which is, the framing that these artists are using, and I mean, like I said, at the opening, Harun Farooqi it's explicitly mentioned how they're like positioning it, right? These aesthetic choices of jump cuts and sampling and spinning and rewind and fast forward. And I know that you wanted to depart the show from thinking about the documentary or film, but I couldn't help but think about the fact that those are techniques that were used by early filmmakers. And I was wondering what was different about those maneuvers when they appeared in video, since they're often treated as this like really important effect of these video works.
I mean, I think that there's no question that there's a relationship there, of course. I think it's more that the idea of montage gets disarticulated with video as it becomes a network. And so the thing that was important for us about Moviedrome was that Vanderbeek, not only did we work with the family and estate to reconstruct it in this way, you know, these are all deliberate choices in terms of how the 16mm film, the 35mm slides, and certain digitized components are projected across the dome, but also that Vanderbeek intended for this to be one of many domes linked by satellite around the world. And so what was the implication of that? And the other aspect of experimental cinema, different kinds of experimental editing, but also expanded cinema, that's really the connection there, I think, to many of the video works in the show. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because already experimental and expanded cinema practitioners are trying to get out of traditional forms of screening a kind of immersive image that had become conventional. So when you see Dara Birnbaum's work, for example, she was also famously creating works that were inserted onto MTV amid music videos. And you see some of these amazing tactics of jump cuts, montage, slow motion, rewind, et cetera, and static that also obtains in the Faraki in a very interesting way. And you know, we could talk about in a little bit the title of Dara's work, which is Tiananmen Square break-in transmission. And that break-in transmission gets figured actually in Faraki's work as well as many others in the show. Stuart, I think
just quickly back to the Vanderbeek, and I think Chelsea Spangerman is on the Zoom, and again, just enormous kudos and thanks to the estate and in the incredible work that Sarah Vanderbeek and Chelsea and many other hands achieved in mounting this, which has been a really long-term dream for a lot of us. It's never been reconstructed to scale. And what was really exciting is it was originally literally the top of a grain silo, and we learned that the fabricator in Pennsylvania still existed. So we used the same fabricator as the original. And in a nutshell, for me, this work is really just like the fever pitch of the 20th century. It was like, Stan wanted like every imaginable kind of projection to be part of this. And so you have, 35 and 70mm slides, 16mm film, 35mm film. And this actually predates video. So it's important to stress that back to your question, Charlotte, that this was not video qua video. It was still film, but it absolutely anticipated so many aspects of video, from simultaneity to the database, to so many of the things that allow us to experience video the way we do now. But you really feel like it's just this like frenetic sort of endpoint of the 20th century, almost this apotheosis that then almost explodes the possibilities of these kinds of image making technologies. And it's also important to stress that he was actively in dialogue with Nam June Paik as well. And so, this world they were envisioning, for us, this is just such an incredible expression of that, not least because it, as Michelle mentioned, it really literally was a satellite, conceived to be a satellite. But then, there's literally a sightline from this work to the Ming Wong that you mentioned earlier, which again really gets to the heart of the database and how video itself is not only the key factor for how we communicate, but when you think about YouTube or you think about the internet in general and the way that memory and what is now live or simultaneous are completely connected. anyway, but yeah, I think that you also see the shift in the dome itself from the analog era to the digital era, because Van der Beek made some of the first ever computer films at Bell Labs. And you see excerpts of those as much as you see some of his earliest collage films. So you see this shift in logic from a 20th century mindset to a 21st century one.
In the previous slide, you can see the computer film excerpt on the left. One of the very, very first deployments of computer graphics outside of Bell Labs.
I mean, since we're on this and since it's such an important piece, I just want to ask a little bit. I mean, you know, just briefly there, you sort of said it was frenetic. It's hard to remember that it must have been, right? Because we're so accustomed to this, like, even more intensity of it. Like I said, I found it really beautiful, you know? And but I hadn't, you know, it's really interesting to have you, you know, point out the way in which it's also this kind of archive and like a database, like it's all these different modalities, it's all these different, and that intentional part of like putting this together. The way you did, I want to talk shortly here about the design and layout of this exhibition, because it just felt so, as I was moving around, just like so intentional, and I became so aware of myself also moving around it, which is really interesting. And maybe in part because this is at the fairly beginning of the show, so you have this kind of immediate, like, where's my body in space type of thing. But I also couldn't help but think just about I mean, it's warm in there, right? Like the enormous amount of power you must have sourced to be able to show this work and all the other works in this exhibition. Was that a challenge? Like, how did you, there aren't wires everywhere to be tripping over. Like I kind of kept expecting to be backstage in a theater, right? Where it's like, you've got all the lights beaming down and like, it wasn't, how did you manage?
I set my own little montage around because I took a photo of our AV manager, Aaron Harrow, surrounded by cables at one point, and then the famous image of Namjoon Pike also surrounded by monitors and cables. And I mean, this was a superhuman achievement for our AV team. So again, you know, I just want to thank them from the bottom of our hearts. But yeah, I mean, they did an incredible job of really achieving what we hope is an elegant exhibition design that makes it, you know, it is an overwhelming show, but like the Van der Beek, you know, it is and it isn't. It's like we wanted things to be paced so that people could even walk through it in 15 minutes and kind of get what the show is about, and then hopefully be compelled to come back and dive deeper and spend more time with individual works, which of course take time. But yes, there's a lot of cabling that you do not see.
But there's also something quite ethereal about a lot of the installations, like the Amar Kanwar, for example, and, you know, relative to, for example, a big sculpture show where you'd be shipping and crating all of these things. In fact, even the prefab grain silo parts are so efficiently brought to the museum, and that was really one of the only you know, large scale physical components. Even though there are many sculptural experiences, much of the infrastructure is actually quite ethereal. And yeah, that was again a very great collaboration with our exhibition design team as well, who are basically architects. So we work with them to configure this kind of space. And then, as you're saying, it's really interesting to think about experiences like subject positions, how someone might have felt, what someone might have felt was frenetic in the 60s, and what someone might feel is actually kind of calming or luxurious today, is itself a fascinating reception history that we definitely wanted to kind of explore and tease out. And you know, don't have easy answers, but there's no question that the kind of sensory stimuli or overload of a certain historical moment gets transformed over time, and different audiences have different reactions.
Since we're here, I'm just going to say, let's just talk about the exhibition and its design. So if we could just jump to slide 21, because I was so struck by it, and it's something that I wanted to emphasize in this talk for viewers. I mean, just the amount of room to be able to experience these works. I think for many audiences, there's this anxiety with this kind of works, one, the sort of pace of the screen, but then also often feeling like you're in these boxes, right? Or like in these confined spaces, or that there's this kind of intensity of like so much material given to you. And it's weird to be starting off with this one, but I'll just say like, there's a lot of space across this exhibition to be with different works at a time. And I was really impressed with how much space you all took to have that effect, right? To make it be its own aesthetic experience. But, because of that, I also became super aware of my own body's, movement, like I said, and, obviously there are some dark rooms that's necessary, right? There's works that are designed to be in those spaces. There's also hallways like this one, right? Then if we go to the next slide, there's also our own need, right? Like as viewers to get up close to an image, right? Then to back up and see the way in which it's being presented like as a set, and to sort of see it at a distance. And so there suddenly really, truly the image kind of disappears and you're getting something that is more this kind of situation of the image. Then actually, if we just back to this one, because this is the Amar Kanwar, and this room, this is my image of it that I took because I was just in such awe of how light-filled it was, which isn't, to be quite honest, how I would have thought I would experience this work. And even this image is already like the shadows are a little too dark, right? Like it's really when you walk in, just very airy and light-filled. And then you're dealing with this really challenging work once you learn more about it, right? The torn first pages. And so there's, and then when you get up close to the work, you can sort of see it behind here, like there's this orange, right? Like the way the colors of the projectors and start to create this color on the wall. So even though you're in this light-filled room, all of a sudden, once you get close to the work, you're actually dealing with all of these intense colors at different moments. And so that sort of perceptual shift that's happening was, really like light art. Right. It had the effect for me of a certain kind of light art. And then I think it's maybe the next slide wanted to just say like, and then you move, shortly thereafter into the Carlos Moda, We Who Feel Differently, which is, I think it should be the next one after this. Yeah. Which is this totally other type of room, right? It's like, it's really colored. I saw so many young people seated in there and like looking at things and talking to friends and so forth, which was its own sort of moving experience. The way the room was really claimed by audiences in a way that I felt like other rooms were not. And then lastly, and then I promise I'll stop talking, the sound buffers that you installed are just so obviously really thoughtfully positioned. I imagine like you all wandering and being like an inch higher, an inch lower, right? Because the noise, it's so not intense, even though you're moving across all these different sounds, right? Throughout the exhibition, it doesn't feel like that. It feels really contained each time you're with them. So with all that being said, I hope I've convinced everyone in the audience that you really do have to go experience this as an exhibition. But can you just speak to a little bit of all of that I just laid out, and maybe some other things I didn't even think to mention?
I just want to start with sound and even those sound panels or sound clouds, as we call them, which again, as Michelle said, like huge thanks to our exhibition designers for making that possible. I think, as we've already stated, we really wanted to move beyond the black box to some extent. And also, to be clear, we have nothing against the black box, but we're trying something very different here, since the black box still emphasizes the proscenium. And, cinema was going in many directions at once at the advent of its history, and it was very quickly standardized. And so, Dara Birnbaum herself had often, we have another work in the collection by her called PM Magazine, in which she made that worksheet talked about it as literally painting out a space for video in the museum, because the museum had never made space for video, in fact, or rarely. And so, these spatial interventions have been such a key part of the history, and that's something we really wanted to prioritize. Of course, that is attended by sound bleed. And so we were willing to accept a certain degree of sound bleed, knowing that that kind of base level of white noise is the soundtrack of the 20th century to some degree. And that was something that interested us. And, there are moments where I'm sure some people are bothered by it, but ultimately we're really comfortable with it because we think it, helped us make a point we really wanted to make. And also the museum itself is a public space. And so to let it be that, in a sense, to turn it into a kind of urban plaza was something we wanted really eagerly to do. And so I also just wanted to mention that our IEV team worked very closely with Sennheiser to develop this listening application so that, there's no perfect solution. But, for several works, you can scan a QR code and then we provide a device, or you can also use your own smartphone to listen to those works, and they're perfectly synced to the videos. So it's a little bit of an experiment that overall we think has worked really well. And, it's a little like VR headsets. We're still in an early phase of these kinds of technologies and we're working things out. And it's exciting to work that out. But, there are certainly artists who really would prioritize acoustics, and those works would definitely require conditions that we're not providing as much in this show, and that's why those works aren't in this show. And there are a dozen times 1,000 other shows we would love to do that, tackle different questions about the medium. But for the purposes of this show, we really wanted to emphasize public space, the apparatus, media architectures, and then to kind of work around that to create the acoustic experiences that we've delivered.
I would just add briefly that actually we do have some works that are not that are related or a part of Signals really, and that are not just on the huge 6th floor exhibition space. So last night, Stuart's department just opened the amazing work, which is all about sound, in the 4th floor Kravis studio, and it's by Lawrence Abu Hamdan, called Walled Unwalled, and it's literally about sound and using sound and thinking about soundscapes in a very, very fascinating way, but it's a video work as well. So I would just add that. But I think, you showed the Zimajewski work, Democracies, this kind of 20-channel array of screens in a corridor. And that work, it's just so fitting because that work is literally all about essentially the artist taking a camera crew around Eastern Europe and the Middle East in the mid-2000s and just taking footage of gatherings of people in public space. And that ranges from military reenactments to some pretty scary right-wing demonstrations to left-wing labor uprisings to a Germany-Turkey football match, which gets even is one of the most riotous events afterward. And so this energy of the crowd unfolding in public space, as well as the kind of sort of ambient raucousness of the sound of these crowds. You can listen to each channel individually, but it's also meant to just be on low volume ambiently in that space. And that work really is about, according to the artist, the fact that, what do we really think? The title is Democracies. What do we really think is a democratic gathering? Sometimes that's actually shades into something a little bit scary. Other times it does feel like it's truly an agora, a public convening. And this, of course, happened. This work was made even before something like the January 6th insurrection here in the States. So when you experience that piece, it's just so prescient, and it, in fact, could be added to at any moment with up-to-date footage of these different kinds of public gatherings. But that really, I think, is a way of manifesting the sort of aspect of that artwork being so core to the actual arrangement in space in the show itself. And then the connoir is interesting too, because as you show, they're rear projections onto these delicate pieces of paper, And not every piece of paper, not every panel has an image on it at once. In fact, many of them are blank sometimes. And it's almost like a mosaic that has been very carefully arranged by the artist. And so your relationship to the image is never just a linear unfolding of start to finish, like you might watch a conventional video or film. It's actually something that has no quote unquote beginning or end. You're kind of surrounded by all these different aspects of the mosaic. And that's also core to the piece itself and the kind of histories that it's telling.
I also wanted to mention something else in relation to the Canloir, which I mean, the title, The Torn First Pages, refers, I mean, the piece in general is about the decades-long pro-democracy movement in Burma. And it focuses specifically on the figure of a bookseller in Burma who, every time he would sell a book, would remove the first page, which was imprinted with government propaganda. And so this was his form of resistance and rebellion, which did ultimately get him arrested after a couple of years. And Amar really just holds this man in such high regard, you know, for his ability to not only resist, but to disseminate information and to try to do that with getting around, you know, the strictures of a military government. And to some extent, I guess, you know, for me, this relates to a much younger artist who's actually featured at the beginning of the show, like Martine Sims, who not only is, you know, highly regarded for her work in video, but also for her own DIY projects and self-publishing and, you know, finding different circuits to get the word out, you know, to think about systems of distribution and communication. And so these dialogues between, you know, a very pre-digital world of print material and, you know, a lot of people talk about the relationship of even small gauge film like Super 8 film and its relationship to video in terms of, you know, its mobility, its portability, and its political efficiency. But what I love about Amar's work is that, you know, it takes video into a much deeper history of information and its distribution and the radical possibilities of doing that. And then even, you know, in the earliest chapter of video, you had really important publications like Radical Software and many others that were actively theorizing the medium as it was being formed. So it's exciting for us to be able to include a much younger figure like Martine, whom we feel is really the heir to these histories in an important way.
I have to say that it's nice to hear you talk about that history of information and presentation, because it was one of the things that really came through for me with the Canloir was the way in which the page, right, the book is no longer this, you know, it's no longer the radical pamphlet, like, right? I mean, I know that people are still producing zines and so forth, and but and that's its own important action right now, but like by and large, the paper mode is no longer doing the work that it was doing back in that moment when you would tear something out. Like, people just don't care in the same way, right, about that medium in that particular way. And so, you know, then having these images, you know, projected onto these sort of thin paper screens really sort of does the semiotic work of like leading us to see how this is like that next thing that's going to, you know, be the pass the baton type sharing of this, you know, of information and of radical thought, or so was the hope.
Maybe that's a good segue too to the guerrilla television projects that we've installed adjacent to the Vanderbeek, but just because one of those is by Cada, a Chilean collective, and it literally documents, you know, pamphlets, i.e. paper, being dropped from airplanes as a means of counter propaganda. And I don't know if we have a shot of those monitors.
We may not.
I'm very confident we don't, because I think we have maybe an install shot of it. But I'm pretty confident we didn't, because I remember thinking to myself, oh, okay, well, I'll move around that in some other way.
That's it's a, you know, it's at the height of the military dictatorship in Chile when they do this, and they somehow commandeer 6 small planes, and then they had printed thousands of leaflets clandestinely with their own sort of activist artistic manifesto of sorts, and then they drop thousands of them from the sky, and then the video is taken by the artist collective, but also by, they get footage from people who are on the ground who happen to get footage of it. as well. And then that's montaged into this sometimes three-channel video work. And again, it's this very actually brave moment of a kind of happening that reprises, of course, the brutal practice of disappearing people by throwing them out of planes, but also the aerial bombing during the coup d'etat in Chile before that. So this idea of like using video to interact with a kind of performance and to interact with historical events, and the memory, the affective memory of those events is really searing. And I just add with the Torn First Pages as well, that for Kanwar, it was precisely this act that the bookseller tearing out the first page of every book, which has that dedication to the military regime in Myanmar, was itself an act of secret and private bravery. And Kanwar says, you know, why he was mystified, like, why did this person do it? He was endangering himself and his family. No one would know that this was happening, but it was such a courageous act. And it was really ultimately a private one for himself. And he faced the consequences years later. But to think of those private acts and then the kind of manifestation of that or elaboration of that in a kind of aesthetic realm is really moving. And actually, we see the Dana Kavalina on screen, and you know, that's another extremely moving work. Stuart, I don't know if you wanted to discuss that a little bit.
Certainly. Yeah, this is a really important piece by a young artist from Ukraine who's now living in Berlin. And it takes YouTube footage of a sort of viral documentary online from the earlier incident in Ukraine in 2014, and sort of embeds that footage, appropriates it, and embeds it in a set of her own collage animations. So in some ways, it's almost equivalent to the Van der Beek in that sense, you know, that it's kind of taking a very early 20th century form and, you know, bringing it in dialogue through montage with viral video. And, you know, given the quick pace of events in Ukraine, and as we mentioned earlier, like the ability of something like TikTok to both capture and even manipulate what's going on there, the slower time of Dana's work felt really important to include. And like by taking the YouTube footage, which, you know, is usually moving at a very different velocity, you know, culturally and politically, and somehow slowing that down and, you know, kind of creating this very poetic, almost surreal meditation on those events felt really important to include. And it's also, that is the one real black box in the whole show, but it's adjacent to a work by Что делать, a Russian collective that was also looking at the impact of a similar time period and literally, you know, a moment that led to Putin's rise to power. And so the dialogue between those two works feels particularly urgent for obvious reasons in this moment.
And I also thought that one of the things that was important about this work, and it sort of touches on what we were saying with the Shah work at the beginning, is this this thing that feels like it's just happened, it's been happening so quickly. It's all in the last year, right? In the Ukraine, is that's how we have learned about it because of the news choosing to present it to us here in the United States because of this particular specific invasion. There's been an ongoing issue that goes back years, arguably centuries, but and I think that that's also like that slowing down that's here, and then having it be this older footage really speaks to this temporal order that really is trying to push against the instant and the immediacy.
And I think it's true again in the Kanwar, you know, there are these three like gate-like screens that have multiple, you know, sheets of paper and projections within them. But one of them is dedicated to guerrilla footage that Amar himself has been collecting. And a lot of the filmmakers are, you know, actively sending him footage that has never been in the media. And, you know, so much of this, again, like almost 40 plus years of resistance in Burma has gone unreported and largely undocumented in the mainstream media. And so the relationship even of that to some of these earlier guerrilla media collectives, or even more recent projects like Media Ninja from Brazil, who are exploiting social media to get the message out. And so, on the one hand, there are tactics that are kind of going almost at the same speed as the media. And then there are others like Amar's or Donna Campolina's, which really slows it down. And Amar specifically talks about slow time in relationship to the political prisoner, in fact. And he's actively tried to put himself in the mindset of someone who is incarcerated to try to understand that temporality. And he wanted to impart that temporality to the torn first pages, in fact.
Yeah, just in the interest of time, because I want everyone to be able to ask their own questions too, I want to wrap up with going to slide 27, just to speak to some of the works towards the end of the show and some of these issues of surveillance that are kind of loosely coming up around us. Because I think, with this work, with Sandra Perry's work, some of this stuff is starting to get, is starting to come out a little bit. And I started to ask in Wipe Cycle, which is at the very, at the beginning of the exhibition, I watched people wanting to stand in front of the camera and see themselves on the screens, right? And, as in the classroom, I find myself, obviously we talk about it as a part of discussing visual culture and so forth, and how often my students say things like, well, no, I know, it's just like, it's everywhere. Like, I'm just like, they've given up on it as surveillance being something that's uncomfortable or anything. And I started, and yet it continues to be a topic that sort of appears. And I was just wondering, is surveillance as uncomfortable as it was in 1969? Like with Wipe Cycle, it was meant to sort of startle you when it was first presented, right? And now people are intentionally trying to position themselves to get there. And I was sort of struck by that juxtaposition, especially with these two works. And at the end of the show, where, right, to be able to be invisible is actually this incredible, powerful move. And at the same time, the exact same work points out how dangerously you could become erased, right? Like Sandra Perry's work really moves across both of those. So it's sort of a broad question, but I'm just wondering how you wound up finding yourselves thinking about it. You've moved to the galleries and seen it, and just thinking about this. I don't know, it's troubling to me the way surveillance seems to be exciting for people.
To Michelle's earlier point too, like just to mention that there are a couple of works that are really crucial to the show that are not on the 6th floor. And one of them is a work by American artist that literally looks at predictive policing technologies, which is a far more insidious form of surveillance, where it's basically criminalizing entire neighborhoods, even in the absence of a crime. And so it is seen through the, a sort of fictional windshield dashboard of a police car. And so, of course, we're all accustomed now to body cam footage and all these things that play out as we witness racialized violence again and again and again in this country. And so the degree to which, the camera is no longer necessarily that of the media, but that of the body cam or that of, the police themselves. And, hopefully that helps, us realize how high the stakes actually are, that, surveillance is not neutral. And as much as social media might be putting a lot of social pressure on people to perform for the camera, to make selfies and to communicate with this almost narcissistic culture that, that is constantly in dialogue with something very racialized and very violent. And so, you can't separate those questions somehow.
Well, I think a lot of the artists, again, in very different moments in time, are exploring the ways in which surveillance becomes something that is internalized. We self-surveil. And then it was fascinating to us. I mean, it's been amazing to see young people walking through the galleries, not only with Wipe Cycle, but Julia Scher's Information America piece, which also involves surveillance cameras. And they're, excited to watch themselves on camera. But I do think that a work like Perry's is so elegant and so deft because it collapses this paradox. At the same time, the bodies that are in these, the performers that are in these two channels of this video work are at once made spectacular, dazzling, I mean, literally, flashing, before your eyes, and at the same time going receding into invisibility. They're fading out of sight. And so for Perry to be able to kind of capture both of those experiences at once is just completely it's just an amazing, amazing piece for that reason. And then there's actually another work that's on the platform just beyond those doors that we see in between the two Perry screens. And it's a single channel work that is by the German artist Michael Klier, that is called The Giant. It's from 1980. And it is an amazing piece that is composed solely of footage from 1980 that he obtained from surveillance cameras all around Berlin. So it creates this kind of very weird poetic montage of shots from parking lots, from public squares, but also inside buildings. And it's truly mind-blowing. I see someone in the chat also invoked 1984 by George Orwell, and that's a great thing to bring up. Oh yeah, this is a shot of these really great viewing stations. And on the left is actually Michael Klier's work with a surveillance shot. 1984 is the subject of a piece by Namjoon Paik that's in another gallery that Paik titled his work Good Morning, Mr. Orwell. And it was a deliberate repost to Orwell's characterization of television as, of course, the big brother par excellence in his novel 1984, and the idea that Big Brother is watching you, collapsing the kind of stupefying experience of commercial television with the nascent networks of surveillance. And Paik himself made this work that would be broadcast to, it was broadcast to 25 million people around the world, a kind of variety show almost, that was Paik's version of saying, television is this sinister thing, but it can also be a force of connection. And he even said, could television pierce the Iron Curtain at this point, broadcast on New Year's Eve in 1984. So again, these themes are really, really running throughout the show in many, many different ways. And you see that. I see also Skip has.
Yes. Can we go back to the previous slide from the video platform just to quickly acknowledge Skip Bloomberg and Video Freaks? And the illustration that you see blown up wall size behind the monitors is actually the one half of the cover for the Video Freaks' incredible book, The Spaghetti City Video Manual, A Guide to Care, Repair, and Maintenance. And again, as we were saying earlier about things like Radical Software, like this is one of those really great publications at the advent of the medium. And we thought a lot about how to sort of end the show and what we should have on this large wall. And in a way, we thought we wanted to go back to the origin point in some ways and, really recognize the emphasis on collectivity. And even the sort of pastoral setting suggests that, there was a lot of interest in ecology and environment, and that technology wasn't necessarily seen as the enemy of ecological concerns, but something that could actually help achieve, a more utopian society on some level. But we also love the subtitle of the book, A Guide to Care, Repair, and Maintenance, in the sense that this is a museum, and a lot of this work only exists because of our conservators. And, they have heroically migrated these videos, and there are still huge chunks of the earliest chapter of video art that no longer exist and we will never see again, sadly. They were broadcast, they were not cared for, but we just love everything that this image represents in terms of the history, the politics from the very outset of artists' engagement with the technology, and we call it our video picnic.
And I should also, we should just mention here, this was one of those moments where I really felt the care you all had, because it was clear you were like, but there's more. Wait, there's more. I want to show you a little bit more. Hold on. I'm just going to set up these little spaces here where you can sit and you can just watch some more, because there's, and it was a really, and you can also watch them online for this brief period that the show is up. And I realized that, but I just thought it was a really nice, it was a nice reminder of how much more than this one exhibit could show, as you all have said, is actually there and still, needing to be thought through. in the interest of time, I have to bow out and allow other people to speak. I'll still be here, of course, but I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry I didn't get to ask you the millions of other questions I had, some about the individual works and other things, but that was inevitable. It's been a real pleasure, and I want to give it a chance to everyone else who's here today to speak with you as well.
Wow, thank you so much, Charlotte, Michelle, and Stuart. That was amazing and extremely generous. We do have just a couple of questions, and I encourage anyone in the audience who has a question to either raise your hand or to post it here in the chat, and we'll give you a chance to ask directly or ask your question. I see a statement in the chat that I want to pose to you, Stuart and Michelle, for comment. The statement is, it appears that the content on the screens, interesting and important though it might be, is not less the point of this show, or ought not to be the point. The point is the fact of video itself. The question posed by the show's title, did video transform the world? And I wonder if you want to reply to that at all from the audience.
Thank you, Davidson. Also wonderful to see you here. I think in a word, we think that it has, but perhaps just not in the ways that maybe they were, that it was predicted to. And so, of course, you know, a lot of the ideas running through the show are about modeling new forms of connectivity and new interactive networks, not just the top-down messaging of, let's say, state or commercial television. But then, of course, we do get these interactive networks at full global scale, starting, let's say, in the 90s. And then there are these phenomena of echo chambers, of filter bubbles, of disinformation. So we see video being used on the one hand as a new form of galvanization of, for example, connectivity of, you know, really actually whipping people into a frenzy or an actual mode of solidarity for various kinds of movements around the world, social movements. On the other hand, we also see it feeding into the disintegration of those kinds of public spheres as well, and spreading disinformation, but also being either used or ignored as a form of evidence or as a kind of mechanical witness, right, in various legal settings where video footage and evidence has become an important component of the way the judicial system works in many places, and yet also can be something that, even though an event may be caught on tape, quote unquote, by a bystander, that may not make a difference in terms of the outcome in which it's used. So these are all at play. And so we definitely think that, you know, artists were fascinated by and engaged directly in this transformation, so to speak. But of course, a lot of the effects have been unpredictable to a certain degree.
This is not exactly answering the question, but it just made me think a little bit. I was also thinking, looking at the photo of Sandra Perry's work, and that is such a powerful piece. It's never been installed the way we installed it, which is literally to take her at her word. You know, the figures are shot in corners of white cubes, and so we installed it in a trompe-l'oeil way to really double down on this question of the white cube. And so we've talked a lot about public space, the urban plaza, but ultimately the site of this show is the museum. And we cannot pretend that the museum is a neutral space. And, you know, it has its own surveying mechanism, for instance. And we are situating these representations, you know, both in the space of the Museum of Modern Art, and also, just to emphasize, this is a collection show. Almost every work in the show is in the collection. So even what does that mean, or what does that produce? But then I also was just thinking about the Lawrence Abu Hamdan work that, as Michelle mentioned, we just opened last night in the Kravis studio here on the 4th floor. And, you know, I hope you can really spend time with that piece, because it is as much about architecture as it is sound or video. And I think this question of a virtual world, or the digital surfaces that we are navigating, and how it forms its own kind of architecture that is now totally imbricated in the physical spaces that we inhabit. And I'll leave it there because I think Lawrence's work really asks some extremely important questions, I think, about control and architecture and media.
Thank you so much for those replies. I see Davidson's raising their hand. I'm going to give them a chance to unmute really quickly.
Thank you very much. Nonetheless, the title of the show does pose the question. And the question is, did video transform the world? And, that's a very interesting question. Back in 1970, there was a show at Brandeis at the Rose Art Museum. It was called Vision and Television. And it was curated by Russell Connor. And at that show, there was a very interesting discussion between Stan Vanderbeek and Frank Gillette. And Frank Gillette, and Stan Vanderbeek, I should say, was defending film. He was a filmmaker and part of a very active avant-garde film community in New York at that time. And he was defending film. You have to understand that at that time, there was a certain, shall we say, hostility between the filmmakers and the video people that existed at that time. And they thought that video was a degradation of film. It was a very inaccurate and gross medium, shall we say. And Gillette, he went on quite extensively defending film. And Gillette answered him in the following way. He said, basically, if you defend a medium, if you defend a medium and all you're defending is the medium, then you are struck by the limits of the medium itself. And he said the point was not to defend the medium, but to defend the content of the medium and the fact and the implications of the medium, you see. And he said, he pointed out at that time that the medium will change, and that there will always be new media. And that, of course, is proven to be quite true. As C.T. Louis said to me once about, well, I guess he was referring to the iPhone. He said, they made everything we wanted, which I thought was an interesting comment. The point I want to make, though, is that we are still at the very beginning of all of this. This is, we tend to think when we're at the present moment that this is it somehow, but this is not it. This is going to go on. We don't know what the future will be. We don't know how it's going to evolve. But we can be sure, I think, that it is going to evolve, and that people look back, upon this time as a primitive and early time in all of this. And one of the things that's very interesting here in this discussion, at this Zoom that we're having now, is for me, and I think for my colleague Skip Blumberg here too today, that because we are of an age, everybody here seems to me to be very, very young, I must say. But to us, you see, having discussion of those times and those beginnings by people who were not there is very interesting. It's interesting to see how we will be interpreted down through the years. That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I am so sorry, but I actually have to run. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone here, and Davidson for your question, and Charlotte and for your moderation, and Skip and everyone. So thank you so much again. And I hope to see you at the show. Bye-bye.
I just wanted to thank David because I think that was a fantastic anecdote about well, all the above, but also a really important point you made about the sort of real animosity between the filmmaking community and the video community. But at the same time, you have to consider somebody like Hollis Frampton, and arguably there's no more important figure that emerged out of experimental film or cinema. But he wrote brilliantly about the digital shift. And I think, yeah. Oh, you're muted, David.
I'll give David a chance to unmute briefly and then.
Thank you. I have an anecdote about Hollis Frampton.
Oh, I'm sure you do.
One of the reasons that Hollis Frampton did not like video was because he could not hold the tape up to the light and see it.
Thank you.
Film, you see, he could hold the tape up to the light. You see, he could see it.
And I just wanted to quickly answer Sean Capone's question in the chat, if I may too. So
I'm going to read the question for the archives so that folks know what it says. I know that in large exhibitions, exclusions will always occur, but I was surprised not to see any work represented by Paper Tiger TV or Alive from Off-Center archives, which were a big part of my early video art education and represented an interesting historic moment. What are your thoughts on this? Thanks, Stuart.
So first of all, Paper Tiger. I keep joking that I want to make a book about all the artists who are not in this show that have been recommended to have been in the show. And of course, there are like thousands of exclusions. And of all of those, the one that I think saddens me the most that they're not in the show are Paper Tiger, but they are not in the collection. As I mentioned, this really is a collection show. We have been in dialogue with Dee Dee Hollick for a while and hope to address this, and that, this show will not be the end of the conversation. There are a lot of initiatives that will come out of it. Dee Dee is hugely important to us, and I think also was actually in residence on the land where the Vanderbeek Moviedrome exists, and she's such a crucial part of this history. So you're absolutely right. It is an unfortunate exclusion from this particular show, but I think we will be actively providing a context for Paper Tiger in due course, we hope. So, and then in terms of Alive from Off Center, I actually studied with John Schott, who was the producer of Alive from Off Center. It literally is why I'm here talking about this show right now. And there are actually works in the show that were broadcast on Alive from Off Center, including Marlon Riggs and others. So yes, but technically that was broadcast on PBS and is not something, again, that we could acquire for the collection due to rights issues, but absolutely a watershed moment in the history of how art was broadcast on television. So thank you for an excellent question.
We do have another question from the audience. Did a discussion of video as design and/or communications practice in relation to video art come up during the creation of the show or afterwards? And is that even a relevant distinction?
In a way, I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I would want to make that distinction in the sense that, again, it's interesting because especially in London, when I used to live there, like the communications courses were often where video was taught and studied and people had access to the equipment. So it is an important, that they were not art courses, they were not art history departments, it was actually communications studies. So it's, it is a really important part of the history. And of course, we keep emphasizing architecture, apparatus, design, so to the extent to which design played a key role, it is absolutely part of the conversation. But ultimately, maybe this goes partly back to David's question too, about, how much the medium should frame this discussion and how much this is, these are issues beyond these kinds of silos.
Thank you for that response. And thank you for that question. I'm going to ask the last question from the Rail. I am wondering if the show is so rich with these amazing artists who come from very different backgrounds and places. And I wonder if there were any curatorial pairings that most excited you when going into the show, bringing works into conversation with one another that maybe had never been exhibited side by side.
Definitely. I mean, again, I really love the final room with Sandra Perry and New Red Order and Every Ocean Hues. And I think the works, speak to each other in the present, but also I think back, towards some of the earlier works too. But there's also a really interesting through line involving China, for instance. If you think about the Tiffany Shaw at the beginning, Dara Birnbaum's work about Tiananmen Square, Ming Wang's work about a history of science fiction and Chinese television and cinema, and on and on. And there are several works on the single channel monitors too. So I think, there are some interesting questions just about how Chinese culture was constructed, how different political strategies have played out there. And so that's, one interesting thread for me. I think even thinking about Carlos's work and Amar's and, the role that activism has played or resistance has played. And again, this question of the database, how you can compile these voices into a single work and, find new ways to articulate them in the present feels important. And we're really happy to have Vanderbeek and Namjoon in dialogue together because, again, as we've heard, they were in dialogue IRL. And so it's nice to have those voices back in the galleries.
Thanks so much. Thank you for your answers to those questions. And thank you again to you and to Michelle and to Charlotte for this amazing conversation. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And so today I'm thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the day, Alyssa Moore, to the Zoom room. Alyssa Moore is a visual poet and writer based in Chicago. They hold degrees from Harvard University and the Iowa Writers Workshop, where they were an Iowa Arts Fellow. They were the inaugural winner of Poetry Magazine's Editor's Prize for Visual Poetry and a writer in residence for Future Poems Future Feed. They're an editor for Ghost Proposal, a journal for visual poetry and work that transcends or sits outside of traditional notions of genre. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Alyssa.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I am really excited to share a few brief poems today. There's been just incredible conversation about media and form and surveillance and how form can be used in protest. And so I'm going to share a couple of visual poems. I will take over the screen, but before I take over, I'm just going to read one little poem. That's the postcard. My good friend Kate Gibble runs a postcard poem press, Send Me Press. So if you're interested in poem postcards, that's where you can find them. What is near me tends me, which is how I learn love. We despise what defies us, which is how we learn distance. Distance and love is long, isn't it? Distance and love is longing. Longing and love is bullshit. Distance is the past, future, or present, depending on which way you're longing. Now I will take over the screen. All right. Just a few short poems. This one is from a bigger project called Current Affairs and Others. It's a whole collection of these desktop collages. I wasn't going to read this one, but there was some talk about surveillance and kind of, our like digital footprints and those sorts of things. So I wanted to share this one. Personal achievement one. I'm pure cash, been currency for centuries, and all I know of myself is the present, the gift of life. Move, I've got to thank someone for it. American therapy informs me. They just didn't know. Yet I was alone in science class, at the bench, at the fume hood. My teacher pocketed the flocculants. I was left with the magnifying glass. She only let me examine one bug at a time. And then over here, there's kind of a little poem made of the different files and the file names. Everyone was going everywhere, and I was the culprit. I regenerate the moment, a bad copy, further proof of my purpose. I started Goliath revisions to Current Affairs. Aretha Franklin, I was the superstar. I'm gonna reshare my screen. Because I couldn't remember what happened to me, I could have envisioned what came next, extending from an infinite pit of jeweled curiosities and sharp sticks. The jewel, my thorns, the sharp points keeping me limber. My higher self was still lost among the fray, still on the scale of what had happened to everyone, what had happened to me barely registered. Never a day without someone warning you to be grateful for your scars. Though when let into the court of all opinion, I was forced to reason because I still had my sanity. I had gotten the better end of things. Thank you again for having me. This one final poem I thought I would share, an interactive poem. There are different paths through this poem, but obviously I'm the one going through this path, so we'll only go through one. But yeah, thanks for having me. An empty auditorium occupies my mind. I am an emissary of the obvious. I am an emissary of the obvious, bound to mortality, sensation rules me. I am an emissary of the obvious, bound to mortality, sensation rules me. With only my life to lose, I tend every distraction. To obvious sensation, with only my life to lose, I tend every distraction. I am obvious to every distraction. I am an emissary of the obvious, bound to mortality, sensation rules me. With only my life to lose, I tend every distraction and speak longer than what is advisable. I am bound to mortality, emissary of the obvious, sensation rules me, my life. With only to lose, I tend every distraction and speak longer than what is advisable. The empty auditorium organizes my mind. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Alyssa. That was an amazing conclusion to today, and we're so thankful to you for sharing your visual films with us. So thank you so much. Thank you again to Michelle. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you to Jack, Kelsey, and Chelsea from the team at MoMA for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can find on the Rails YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with LaToya Ruby Fraser and Jessica Holmes on the occasion of More Than Conquerors, a monument for community health workers of Baltimore, Maryland, 2021 to 2022, on view now at Gladstone, New York. We'll conclude with the poetry reading by Madison MacArthur. And if you're free tonight, join us at the Rubin Museum of Art for the Rails April issue launch party. You can find details for that in the chat as well. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you go see the show at MoMA.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for the reading, Alyssa.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Alyssa, for those poems. Those are really great.
So
Thank
great.
you.
Thank
Thanks
you
again.
so
Bye.
much.
Bye, everybody.